How many of you have already read Boys in the Valley? That's pretty good. There will be no spoilers. We are not going to spoil anything, but that is like I'll be very sensitive to that because I don't like to spoil anything. I don't even like to read the dust jacket copy on books before I buy them. That's how I like to go in. But if you'd like to start out talking about what is Boys in the Valley about?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, I just noticed the camera's on, I guess. So Boys in the Valley is about 30 orphans who live in an orphanage in rural Pennsylvania. It's turn of the century, so it's 1905. Majority of the book takes place in 1905. It is a secluded orphanage in the middle of nowhere, and run by these Catholic priests, and it's about 3 hours horse ride from any major or even minor city. So they're very isolated, and they feed themselves. They live off their own, they live off the land. They grow their own vegetables. They have their own animals. So it's all very self-sustained, and they're between the ages, I think, of like 8 and 16 essentially, and it's a heavy discipline environment. So it's very strict, and the boys are all come from these horrible backgrounds for the most part. So it's a tough environment. And then one stormy night, there's a knock on the orphanage door, and it's the sheriff from the next town, so about 3 hours away. He has this man. The man is in a hood, a sack that's been placed over his head, and he's bloody and he's injured. And this is not spoilers on the book jacket, but the man is brought into the orphanage. They're hoping that one of the priests will save his life, keep him alive, so they can get him back to town and do what they're going to do to him because he's done some horrible things. The man ends up dying at the orphanage, and when he dies, the evil that is inside of him is released into the orphanage and infects or infests, however you prefer, a portion of the children. And you don't 100% know which children were infected and which were not. But so the whole rest of that book is about these kids being in this sort of like trapped hot box of violence and horror, some of whom are now infiltrated by this evil and some of whom are not. And basically the whole book's about what happens after that.
So what inspired that? Did you travel back in time to an orphanage?
In some ways, I traveled back in time. In the sense that I'm also a screenwriter. So about a decade or so ago, I was researching ideas for horror screenplays because I was kind of at the time pitching stuff to Blumhouse, and I wanted to come up with some new ideas. And so I was just sort of like researching randomly, came across an article about this orphanage in Pennsylvania at the turn of the century where the orphans, a good portion of the orphans who lived there had mysteriously vanished. And there was no good explanation ever given by the guardians who ran the orphanage, and it became kind of an investigation, and ultimately the orphanage got shut down. The rest of the kids got sent to other orphanages or sent to factories or whatever it was. And that was like the whole article, but I read that and I was that's what spurred my idea of like, oh, that's interesting. It's sort of like a Roanoke situation, right, where the village vanished. So it's kind of like that, where I was like, why don't I talk about what happened at that orphanage and what caused those kids to disappear. So that was the original acorn, if you will, and also why I said it where I said it, and being Pennsylvania, because that was where it was in the article, so I just went with it.
And I think that for me was the scariest part of the book, because you can kind of feel that isolation. You feel that help is not coming away.
Correct.
Not coming to save these kids. They don't have families that are looking for them. And so they're isolated in so many horrific ways. And it's also like so far back in time where like we really don't know what happened. It's sort of like in the dark you can believe in the supernatural and in isolation. Did you research orphanages or?
Yeah, actually I did. And part of that isolation, which I didn't mention, is once that man dies, the whole book takes place I think over like 3 days. So a massive snowstorm hits and basically snows them in. So to your point, there is no help coming. No. There is no real escape. And those their options get more and more limited as the story goes on. But yeah, I did research orphanages quite a bit actually, of that time period. What happened to orphans? It's a lot of very sad stories about orphans in that period of time where they are sold to factories as kids and stuff like that, and killed. And even in the book, again, first chapter, not a spoiler at all, but where Peter, who's our main protagonist, is just thinking about the oncoming winter, and he casually just thinks to himself that, boy, I hope everybody survives the winter.
Yeah.
Because it's not even it's just an afterthought almost to him. So yeah, so it's a very, very hard life, and there's not a lot of food, and they're all basically on the edge of starvation. And then when the winter hits, it's even worse. So that was how it was for a lot of them, and I also learned a lot about in my research. I researched like what kind of clothes they all wore, like what were their sort of uniforms, and I kind of worked that into the book. How were the orphanages? Stupid stuff like how were they heated? How did they go to the bathroom? How did they wash their hands? What words were commonly used? What words were not commonly used? How did they talk? What was the dialogue like? So I also read I would read biographies or autobiographies from that period just to kind of get a sense of language. So a lot of that kind of stuff goes in. Mm-hmm. And I've written a couple of historical pieces. I wrote a historical novella called Shiloh, which is about the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. And then I also just finished a new book called Seraphina, which takes place also during the Civil War period in the South. So that was an absolute monster to research. So this was a little bit easier in the sense that the orphanage is pretty self-contained. I didn't have to get into a lot of what the cities were like, or what the cars were like, or what people were like, or what politics were like, or anything like that. Yeah. I was just like, how did the kids talk? What did they wear? Okay, let's go.
Right. And then, I was an altar boy, so I was a Catholic altar boy who stole donuts on the way to serve mass.
Wow.
So I understand Catholicism is a complicated thing. And, when I read the book,
did you steal donuts or donut holes?
I stole the donuts.
Full round donut.
No, I walked in and
because donut hole I could see is sort of. Okay.
No, 6:30 mass, and then I served mass, and I got tipped. Somebody tipped me for serving mass.
Wow.
Wow. So when I read the book and I recognized the Catholic underpinnings of this now, because I want you to talk about the Catholicism, the religion aspect, but it's really the belief that drives these people.
Yeah. So the Catholicism angle or the religious angle is really plot device. It's really just a means to an end for me. It wasn't anything where I was going into it wanting to make some sort of statement for good or for pro or against religion. It wasn't really a theme I wanted to necessarily pursue. But if you're going to have a story take place in a Catholic orphanage and there's going to be demons involved and priests, then you're going to get into that stuff. So I did get into it, and Peter is being groomed to be a priest in the book. So it's one of the kind of coming of age conflicts that he's dealing with throughout the story. So, but to Jeff's point, yeah, it's really more about these kids discovering who they are through a very traumatic, borderline supernatural, situation, and they're kind of thrust into the fire, as it were. And and a lot of the characters, like Peter, I mentioned. Is he going to be a priest, or is he not does he not want to be a priest? And he's sort of lured by this, not lured is the wrong, but there's a young girl who lives at a nearby farm, and he goes to visit that farm with Father Andrew, who's sort of his mentor and father figure, and they become friends, him and the girl. So he kind of gets a sense of what a normal life might be. So he's got some decisions to make. But then when things get violent and horrible and really horrible and really violent, and he's sort of in this position as he's kind of like this older brother, he's sort of a guardian himself of all these smaller kids. So now it becomes, well, it's not just about me, it's also about what do I need to do to save these kids. And there are moments where you are part of that process with him. So one thing about this book that I mentioned is Peter's chapters are told first person and the other POVs are told third person. And the reason I did that was because I wanted Peter to be the one holding the reader's hand and guiding them through the story. And so you become very immersed in Peter's decision making. And there are other characters that are equally conflicted, but I don't get quite as deep as I do with Peter. I don't think the reader would feel quite as immersed. You can disagree, but like David is a very conflicted character.
It would bat you around too much.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you get a sense of those characters, and you do dip into backstories, Johnson and David, and you get a sense of every person in that orphanage is dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that to me gives the story the heart and the struggle that Peter has with his own decisions, and how I think that gives it a layer of complexity that shows that there's a supernatural struggle in some regards, and then very real. They were already dealt a bad hand.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I actually I won't say struggled with, but I was very aware of when I was writing the book. I didn't ever want the supernatural elements to outshine or outshout, or however you want to put it, the character elements. And I really wanted the book to be about these kids and these decisions that they were making. Even the kids who are infected or infested, or they're still making their own decisions. This isn't like The Exorcist, where a demon takes over a child and that child has gray skin and bad teeth, and it vomits the pea soup and stuff. These kids are very much the same kids they were, but their choices, their motivations are now sort of amplified, and there's a certain empowerment to doing what they do, and they do things that they probably would not have done, but now they do. And David is an interesting character because in many ways he kind of agrees with what these kids are doing, because he hates the orphanage and he hates these priests and he hates his life there. So he's not necessarily that upset that like there's this rebellion going on, but he doesn't agree with the way it's being done. And he's also kind of a protector of the other kids. So, and he's also following sort of Peter's lead too. They're kind of like brothers in a way but they're also like sort of polar opposites. So David has a lot of conflict where he is legitimately like confused as to why he's doing the right thing over and over again, because part of him is saying that he feels like he should be doing the opposite, but because of the character that he has and the kind of heart he has, he ends up doing something that confuses even him, he was a really fascinating character to write.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the book to me was, I remember when I read it the first time, I felt like it was the weird balance of a slow burner but a fast page turner. And I felt like, you start with this sort of explosive prologue, and then you get a little bit of a character build, and then this other explosive event. So those things sort of dominate, but it's the getting to know. How did you do that pacing? Was that like intentional? I'm sure everything was intentional, but like, how did you find that rhythm? Because I think it worked really well. I've never read a book that I could say those two things about.
Yeah, so somebody asked me, I think it was when I was in Houston, somebody said, how do you write something with so much horror and suspense in it? And I said, well, those are actually two different things. So horror is what happens in the story and what shocks the reader, or makes the reader feel a visceral reaction to what's happening, or an emotional reaction to what's happening. Suspense is something that is the way, is in large part done by the way I write the story. So, the way you write chapters, the way you feed information to a reader, the way you kind of keep some information hidden and allow other information to come through, the way you maybe end chapters, the way that I alternate the POVs, so that you're never really feeling like anything's too repetitive. You're kind of, in the book, you're kind of bouncing around this orphanage, and you're kind of getting all these different perspectives, and some of them almost overlap, in a way where, the same, you're kind of seeing some of the same event, but now from a different.
I'm thinking of the chapel scene.
The chapel scene, or even the scene when he's Brother Johnson's handing out tools, and there's a confrontation with him and Peter. So I think that's another reason that's another way to build suspense in a novel is, and to keep it moving, to your point, is just to make sure that you're not, all the information that you are getting as readers is fresh and new to you, whether it be because of perspective or whether it be because I'm telling you a little bit more of the story, or I'm maybe teasing a little bit about what's going to happen. So, and that's also a big element, like is teasing certain things. So yeah, to your point, it's definitely planned. I have, when I write a novel, I write like a couple pages of like, this happens and this happens and this happens and this happens. These are the kind of the characters, and I kind of let that work in my head. But then I do like an incredibly detailed outline, chapter by chapter, and I have little notes for each chapter as to what happens here, what am I teasing here, what information is happening here, what are you finding out here. So it's very much planned out. And then when I write it, like I wrote the first draft of the novel in about 4 weeks, and then I did another rewrite, which took me a few more weeks, and I had to kind of rush the rewrite because Paul Miller at Earthling wanted the book, and when he said he wanted the book, I just finished it. Like I think I finished it like a couple days before he asked for it, and I was like, just give me a couple weeks to do a quick rewrite. So I did a rewrite of the whole thing, and then handed him. That's essentially that book. I mean, we did some cleanup, but really not much change.
Well, I think you had the advantage of having had written the screenplay beforehand, which they're
huge.
You did change things, so that's curious to me. You wrote the screenplay, which people could read if they supported the Kickstarter.
Yes.
Awesome. And there's extra things in the screenplay that aren't in the book. But so I do want to talk about you as a screenwriter and then as a novelist, and what do you feel it did for the story? Was there, like, when you wrote it as a screenplay, what was the incentive? You were just going to try to sell that screenplay to a production house and have that?
Yeah, I wrote the screenplay, exactly right. I even pitched it to Blumhouse and at one point, and they didn't want it. So, it's just a screenplay I wrote, and and then when my fiction, horror fiction career sort of took off in around 2015, I had all these great stories that I'd already written and were never produced or never sold as screenplays, and so I wanted to tell those stories still. So I adapted my own work into novels. Gothic is another example of a screenplay I adapted into a novel, and it was really fun because they're two completely different mediums, and in a screenplay it's like your visual action dialogue, visual action dialogue, visual, and that's it. So to be able to go really deep into these characters and explore their motivation and explore their conflicts and get more into the psychology of the different kids and why they did the things they did, and to be able to describe to a reader what it feels like to be possessed, was also something I could never do in a screenplay. In the screenplay, it's literally exterior, blah blah blah, sun is setting, Peter, dialogue or whatever. So there's not much. You're not really getting a lot of that internal stuff.
So when you approached it as, now I get to blow this up, I can color in the lines, I can make it this fully three-dimensional thing, this living. So that was exciting for you. Did you feel frustrated, writing screenplays, like you're hitting a wall, or I'm trying to see, is that was it exciting? Were you champing at the bit? It's champing. It's
champing, right?
Champing.
And it's lead LED. Screenwriting is a really weird profession. You have to really like the art of screenwriting because it's very technical, and it's something that you do really for others to create something with, versus it's your own kind of artwork or your own sort of creation. So it's just a different thing. So for me, I was much more excited about writing the novel version of Boys in the Valley than I was the screenplay. The screenplay I did work really hard on, but I did ultimately end up changing quite a bit in the novel that was in the screenplay. But like I said, screenwriting is much more of you do a lot of work, and you either don't sell it, and so nothing happens, or you sell it and somebody else rewrites it into something else, or you sell it and you spend the next year rewriting it because of locations and budget and the directors and the actors and all this other stuff. So I always think of screenwriting as a foundation upon which other people can build something, and whereas fiction is like it's all mine.
I would think that's a scary endeavor because you've outlined the recipe and now you've handed it to a chef. Are they going to pull it off? Are they going to make this meal? Like, because when you do the screenplay, you have to have a director, actors, and all this other talent bring it to life. Whereas when you write it, you're the sole creative.
Yeah. Yeah, no, is that scary to me?
I think that.
No, I love it. I love having full control. I love having full control of the end product. And then, when you sell, because ironically, I've sold Boys in the Valley now for adaptation. So there's another screenplay that's been written by somebody else. So that's being, shopped around. Well, once the strikes are over, everything's on pause right now. But so I much prefer writing the book or the story and then having somebody else go do the movie stuff or the TV stuff, because then I don't really want to be involved that much with that part of it. I just want to keep writing the stories and the fiction, and I'll take the check and I'll take the credit. But other than that, I kind of and also it's like in my mind, and this is something that I learned from, and you've read the same thing about Stephen King. He said something about this where he's like, I don't see it I see it as somebody else doing their own thing with the story, and it's really more about them and their vision. So I don't really mind not participating. That said, I wrote a screenplay for one of my short stories that's being adapted, a story called Death My Old Friend. That's the last story.
Great story.
Beneath the Bell Sky, yeah. And then I'm working with the filmmakers who are doing Alter, making that into a movie. So we're kind of in cahoots. But then the other, I think I've got 7 projects right now that are all different stages of early development. So most of the other ones I'm not involved with at all. So, but a couple I am, which is fun.
So when you're writing a screenplay versus writing a novel, are you thinking of two different? So when you write the novel, do you think of the reader? Like, when does the reader factor in, or is it just like you're creating this, and then?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm always thinking of the reader. No, I think of the reader from the get-go because I'm thinking about the story, but I'm really thinking about how do I tell this story so I get the response that I want to get from the reader, or response might not be the right word. How do I tell this story so that the reader gets the best possible experience would probably be the better way to phrase it. So there are some so I'm kind of strange in this way that all my stories and books are kind of, they're very different. They're tonally different. I write them differently. So I kind of serve the story. So if the story needs a more pulpy, loud, brash, crazy, kind of prose, like Gothic, then that's how I write it. If I want the prose to be a little denser and I want the pacing to be a little bit slower, like this new book I just wrote, then that's how I want. Then that's how I write it. So my short stories vary wildly in tone, and so I'm always kind of serving the story. So because I want the reader's experience for that story to be the way I envision that story experience to be. So, but I'm always thinking about the reader in the sense of how I tell the story, so it's the most effective.
And I gotta say, like, I've been reading Stephen King since I was 13 years old. Big time Stephen King fan. I love his stuff. He's got a magic, but his characters are so similar from book to book. It's like, I recognize you. You got a new name now, new job. Congratulations. And now I've read, Gothic, Boys in the Valley, Child Alone Strangers, Commodore. Can I name the other books? I've read some books that haven't been born yet.
Wow.
So Observe, Blue Butterfly, and Serafina. And I gotta say, it's great because the characters are so different, and they are not like Beth from Observe isn't in any other book.
No,
she's incredible. Wait till you guys meet her.
And you will meet her. That book's been sold. That's coming out in the next year. So
yeah, and it's hard to pick a favorite, but it's in some ways it's pretty easy because the books are so different. But I've not been disappointed by anything you've written, and it's just a baseline for me. I think Stephen King is sort of the baseline for comparison, and there really wasn't a question.
No, thanks. No, keep going.
Just an observation. But what is the best thing a reader could say to you? Like if you wrote a book and then they came up to you and said, "This book, blank," like what is like the most satisfying? So you guys can say something later.
Yeah, no, I love when readers tell me that they had an emotional reaction to a story or a book, whether it's anger or.
But it has to be appropriate, emotional. Is that something?
I don't, and like, or but yeah, I don't want to spoil anything. So, but
yeah, I can't.
So, but yeah, so people get emotional. A lot of people have gotten very emotional reading this book. So, and they've expressed that to me time and time again. So that's great. So, and like I always think about it as when I tell us, see, I don't really have any desire to be one of those writers who, and I don't mean this negatively at all, because they're making way more money than I am, but who are like cranking out a book a year, and it's always kind of like, oh, and here's like another book that's kind of a retelling of this trope, and here's a retelling of this trope, and here's a retelling of this trope, and it's just kind of like fun, and it's frivolous, and you can read it in a couple days, and it's not, and I don't mind that. I mean, I try very hard for my books to have some sort of impact. I try very hard for my stories to be scarring in some way, whether they be emotionally or psychologically. I really want people to remember my stories, and for them to like think, there's no better compliment to me than somebody saying that they were emotionally affected by a story that I wrote, because they'll remember that, and they'll remember that feeling, and they'll be like, tell a friend, like, I read this book and it scared me, or I read this book and it made me so sad, or whatever. And that's kind of what I'm going for. I don't always achieve it, obviously, but that's, to me, the best thing that I can do for a reader is make them feel like they had an experience that affected them emotionally and psychologically, and it wasn't just like, okay, next, book in the stack. So I try for that. I don't always I know for a fact I don't always get there because I've read their Goodreads reviews, but I do try. That's the best thing.
I think you just gotta stay off.
I do stay off. I try.
It's good because if you look at the negative reviews and they're consistent and they're intelligent and they're like, hey, I have a problem with this. That's one thing, but a lot of them are just. But I noticed when I mentioned the books I read, I didn't mention Don't Let Them Get You Down, and that had for me the biggest emotional reaction. Wow, that was so visceral, that book, and I think for different people, obviously, it's going to hit different. But it is much more literary. It's like it's definitely not in the normal wheelhouse of other things you've written.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with it, so I wrote a book called Don't Let Them Get You Down, which is actually a book I wrote a little bit a decade ago, and then kind of rewrote it. A couple years ago and sold it, and it's not genre. It's about depression and anxiety, and the whole story is about a guy. The story begins with a guy having just gone through a period of clinical depression, and now is back into society and back at his job, and he's trying to figure out how to get back into life again, and how to start dating again, and how to make friends, and all that stuff that's very, very hard for people who have been through something like that. So that's really what the book is about. But yeah, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to read if you've been through it, or even if you haven't been through it, I would guess.
I had to sip it, and I just because there were moments in the book. I mean, my hands are sweating right now thinking about it, and it's just because it's that human connection. It is so real and authentic, and it's like, wow, this person's been there. And it's not a fun place to be. But that's an excellent book. It's just beyond belief.
And I will say this, sorry, but I will say, part of, I think, what's weird about the writing journey for me, and if you guys are writers, it might interest you, but I have tried writing horror before in my life, and I failed miserably at it. And I think that I think writing books like Don't Let Them Get You Down, and The Egotist and Happy Holidays, all these books I wrote when I was like in my 30s, and then all the stories that I wrote when I was in my 20s and 30s, I think I was kind of, and then meanwhile reading horror and and writing horror screenplays, but I never made that like connection. And then it just, I think there was a moment when you understand how to write characters, and then when you combine that, it was when I was able to combine that with writing fun, scary, wild stories. I think that was when I connected, and all of a sudden everything I started writing became publishable.
Was that an epiphany all on your own, or did you have a writer say, "Hey," like, because I know you do the Dark Word podcast, which is incredible. It's a podcast for writers talking about the craft, the business. I think it's interesting, even if you're not a writer. I mean, I've listened to it. It's incredible, some of the incredible talent you've had. So was that move, that thing that you recognized that made it different?
Yeah, it was a total thunderbolt moment or lightning bolt moment. Or I was actually, I was working for a marketing company at the time, and I was walking around the block frustrated and hating my life, and I was talking to my wife on the phone, and marketing's for chumps. And Jeff was in marketing. I was making fun of him and everyone else. And we were just talking. I don't know what we were talking about, and I was just kind of saying, like, I just don't understand, like, why I can't just write horror fiction. And it kind of, like, I actually think stopped like mid-sentence. I'm pretty confident. I don't think my memory's false in this. I think I had stopped walking and was like, wait a minute, why don't I just write horror fiction and try that as a thing? And that's when it kind of, like, the big epiphany moment. So it was just one of those things I was talking through what I was going to do next. And the screenwriting wasn't really going anywhere, and the fiction writing wasn't going anywhere, and so I just decided to do the chocolate peanut butter thing.
So what makes it a horror book? Like, when you think about that, because when I think of horror, when I think of Stephen King and Stephen King's horror, I'm like, I'm not really scared. Like, Stephen King doesn't scare me. And what's the metric by which you say, all right, that's a horror book?
Yeah, so I kind of talked about this a little bit in the past, which is I feel like horror is a very unique genre because I've written science fiction and I've read a lot of fantasy and I've written non-genre work, but horror is kind of the only genre where you can sort of do anything you want. And science fiction has certain rules, and fantasy books have certain rules. And obviously, if you're not writing speculative fiction, then you're stuck in reality, which is a horrible place to be. So when I write horror, I love it because anything can happen. And so my classification of horror is that it's beyond all those other genres, and it's the sandbox has no borders. And the analogy I use is like in horror, you can open that closet door, and there can be nothing in the closet, or there can be a dead body in the closet, or there can be a monster in the closet coming at you, teeth and claws, or it can be a portal to another dimension, and it's all, like, it all works. It's all horror. And so, I don't know, I guess for me, horror is if it's unclassifiable, and if it's end of scary, you gotta throw in end of scary stuff happens, right? That's the only thing I can think of describing it, but that's how I can describe it.
Well, when I read Commodore, I feel like Robert Goulet with a micro. I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows Robert.
I don't know. I don't know.
You don't know who he's like a Vegas lounge singer. I don't know. I just feel like
actor. Yes.
I know Tony Bennett is.
Tony passed away.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, now
He
recently too.
I brought the room down.
He's incredible.
That's incredible.
He was incredible. When I read Commodore, I thought that reminded me of Stephen King most, because it was a bunch of young kids. They're on their bikes. They're going to a junkyard. I'm not spoiling anything, by the way, but they're all very, like, that wonder, that childhood wonder of anything's possible. This junkyard's got some crazy stuff going on. Let's go check it out. Mm-hmm. What are you going to get? Tetanus? I don't know. So they go there, but what I liked about it even more than a Stephen King story is, in a Stephen King story, as terrible as they can be, you still feel safe. I still felt safe reading it. Like, the kids are in danger, but, and not to spoil anything in that book, but sometimes that danger is pretty bad. But in Commodore, what did you do, Philip? I'm like, this is going this way, and then he's like, oh yeah, we're going the full distance here, and that was.
So Commodore is about these kids who go to a junkyard, like Jeff said, and they find an abandoned car, and the car is sort of legendary in their little town of Sabbath because kids who have gone looking for the car in the past have disappeared. and never returned. And so these kids go looking for the car and they find it, and then the story is about what happened with the car. I like to do things that are very weirdly contained. Like Commodore is like a 45,000 word story, and the whole story pretty much takes place inside this abandoned car.
Yeah.
I have another story called Fate of Nero that's like 9,000 words, but the whole story takes place in a bathtub. I have one where the whole story takes place in a swimming pool called Alter. So I had this weird affinity for like contained stories, but
it definitely focuses the vibe, the feeling. But what I really liked about it is that we're as a Stephen King reader, as some I keep saying Stephen King, but as a reader of fiction, you do feel like, okay, this is where the story should go, but you take it in a different direction almost every single time. And
yeah, very purposely.
yeah, it's not like plot twist. It's sort of like, this development is new. It just feels so new.
Well, yeah, you know, I've read a lot of fiction, and one of the things that I, as a writer, is if I'm writing a story and I feel like I'm getting a little, for lack of a better word, bored, or if I kind of feel like I know what's going to happen next, and it doesn't really interest me that much, or it's not blowing the doors off, or it's not exciting me, I kind of take a step back, and I'm like, okay, what if I just did this? Like this, what if I just went a completely different direction? And then when I start getting excited about that direction, that's when I know, okay, now that's because that's what I know that will excite a reader, just like Jeff's saying, is I really try very hard. I don't always succeed, but I always try very hard to make things unexpected so that you don't feel like you're just reading the same kind of story that you've already read. And I always try to like change direction in ways that are, but that also serve the story. And
Right.
to Jeff's point, it keeps things it tends to elevate the tension and elevate the horror versus like distract.
And it's not like a bait and switch. It doesn't feel like I was expecting Ross and Rachel to get together. What? And you just didn't. She's with Joey. I mean, I didn't watch Friends, but you don't feel robbed. You don't feel like this or Deus Ex Machina. How do you say it? Is it Machina?
I think you get it right.
Machina. Yeah.
But it just doesn't feel like. So anyway, I don't know how we're doing on time. I could just stay up
I don't know.
do the lounge.
It's 7:15. So we're talking for 45 minutes. I can do a reading.
You could do a reading. We could also.
Yes.
On the web.